Davros' side, known as the Imperial Daleks, eventually won the conflict and cast those who followed the Black Supreme Dalek and the Dalek Prime out into space. With both factions greatly weakened and desperate, the Doctor, now in his 7th incarnation, had come to regret not destroying the Daleks at their point of birth, and saw their weakened state after the Mavellan War as a golden opportunity to finally rid the universe of their filth once and for all. Using an ancient Time Lord weapon known as the Hand of Omega, which he had stolen all those centuries ago when he fled Gallifrey as an insurance in case the Time Lords came after him, the Doctor lured a group of Imperial Daleks to Earth, specifically London in the 1960s. He had buried the Hand of Omega here centuries ago, whilst in his first incarnation, believing it was the perfect hiding place. The Doctor hoped that the Imperial side would find the Hand of Omega and, in their attempts to use it, be destroyed, with the Doctor having programmed the hand to do so if Davros tried to use it. Unfortunately, things got a little out of the Doctor's control as the renegades unexpectedly arrived and began to war with Imperials all over the streets of 60s London, with the renegades briefly triumphing and stealing the Hand of Omega. The Doctor, however, was able to infiltrate their base and trap them on Earth by sabotaging their time vessel long enough for the Imperials to wipe out the renegade faction and steal the Hand of Omega, after which, just as the Doctor predicted, Davros' attempt to use the hand instead led to the destruction of Skaro and the Imperial Dalek mothership, killing all the Imperials and possibly Davros himself. There have been sightings of Davros since, and rumours that he escaped the mothership, but currently no verification if they are real or not. Finally, believing he had rid the universe of these monsters once and for all, the Doctor, for many centuries afterwards, enjoyed arguably a much greater peace of mind than he had done since before he first encountered them on Skaro in his first incarnation. Even before giving up his golden opportunity to exterminate them at the point of their birth, which happened in his 4th incarnation, the Doctor always felt responsible for what the Daleks became, due to his first visit to Skaro. From his point of view, that visit unintentionally let them know that there was life in the universe to conquer, beyond the last of the Thals on Skaro. The Doctor often lamented that had he not visited, maybe the monsters in their arrogance would have been happy to remain in their dark, desolate corner of the universe, convinced they were the only life forms. When I first met the 8th Doctor, like I said, he seemed much more full of life, sure of himself, and able to appreciate the beauty of the universe more than even his other incarnations. The Doctor always had a great zeal for life, it must be said, but underneath the bravado, with his other incarnations, particularly the 5th and 11th Doctors, there always seemed to be a sense of great torment and regret over the horror he felt he had unleashed with his oldest and bitterest enemies. Even if it wasn't conscious, the Doctor always, deep down it seemed, believed that no matter how many worlds he saved, it was never enough. Sadly, the Doctor's relief came to an end when he discovered that, against all odds, some of the Daleks had survived their supposed final end. The renegades were not actually led by the Dalek Supreme, rather they were led by the Dalek Prime. According to the legends, this was one of the first Daleks that led the attack on the Thal city and later shot down Davros all those centuries ago. It was, in fact, the only one of Davros' original Daleks that had survived all this time, being kept alive long past even the long lifespan of a Dalek through numerous means, in a similar fashion to Davros himself, ironically. Both the Dalek Prime and Davros hated each other, perhaps to a greater degree than either did even the Doctor. The Dalek Prime was a shadowy figure, ruling from behind the scenes and almost never taking part in conflicts itself. Some believed it just to be a myth, created by the Daleks themselves, of this immortal Dalek above and beyond the Supreme Council and the Emperor. Even the majority of Daleks themselves weren't sure if it was real or just Dalek propaganda. Sadly, as the Eighth Doctor discovered, it was real. Having been stationed on the planet Anatolin, the Daleks' only remaining colony at that point from their former Second Empire, the Prime had remained in constant contact with the Dalek Supreme during its mission on Earth to find the Hand of Omega. Little did the Doctor know, the Dalek Supreme had scanned the entirety of the Hand of Omega when it was in his custody and sent the information to the Dalek Prime back on Anatolin. The Black Dalek Supreme, however, was later left on Earth after the destruction of its battle force, where the Dalek Prime allowed it to think that the Doctor had destroyed Anatolin too, which actually caused the Dalek to kill itself in what can only be described as grief. The reason for this was because the Dalek Prime did not want to send more of its troops to Earth to rescue the Supreme, which could have alerted the Doctor to the fact that there were more renegades. He knew it was better to work in secret against both the Doctor and the Time Lords when it had access to their secrets. Whilst the technology of the Hand was still above even what the Dalek Prime was capable of, the monster was, nevertheless, able to use the information the Supreme gave him to construct a machine that allowed the Dalek to abduct the Doctor's TARDIS whilst he was in his 8th incarnation. You have to remember that the Doctor's TARDIS was also not the most advanced model. In fact, it had been obsolete for centuries by the time the Doctor had stolen it. Incidentally, this is why it resembles a blue police box. Apparently, those were common back in the 1960s London, where it's known the Doctor spent quite a bit of time. So much so, it's when the first serious research into him by humans began. TARDISes have the ability to change their outer appearance in order to blend into their surroundings, whilst their inside always remains the same size and shape. However, the chameleon circuit, which allows this, was damaged after assuming the form of a police box during a visit to 1960s London, resulting in it being stuck in that shape seemingly forever. What was once an obsolete piece of Earth technology has now ironically gone on to be recognised on many planets around the universe, especially Skaro. After capturing the Doctor and his TARDIS, the Dalek Prime subjected him to extreme torture in an effort to truly discover the secret to the Hand of Omega. The Dalek assigned to torture the Doctor was Dalek X, the second oldest Dalek in existence. He was originally the Dalek Supreme, tasked with the Spiridon mission. After the failure of that plan, he was demoted to the head of interrogation rather than destroyed due to his years of service, but his somewhat more unstable personality, even by Dalek standards, led him to becoming notorious among the enemies of the Daleks for his cruelty. Human soldiers in the Second Dalek War named him Dalek X, or the Devil in Dalek form. Their worst fear was to end up in one of his camps. Whilst the Daleks generally have no need for names, the disgraced Supreme came to embrace this title purely for psychological warfare due to the fear it carried. Much like with the Master, some have doubted the Dalek X could have been responsible for all of the things he had been credited with. The Doctor assures me, however, that our history books, many of which would make your stomach churn reading about Dalek X's experiments, couldn't even begin to comprehend what that monster was capable of. In spite of this, Dalek X failed to break the Doctor, who remained defiant in the face of his greatest enemies. Ironically, the Daleks had influenced the Doctor this way, as his hatred of them drove him on as much as his love for humanity and other races. New mind control technology developed by the Daleks did eventually allow them to later turn the Doctor into their puppet. However, the Daleks had always been unable to take control of the Doctor before, as Time Lords have the power to place barriers around their mind, which can render them immune to most forms of hypnosis. They can still fall victim to suggestive hypnosis, but not anything that would ever change who they are. Dalek Prime and Dalek X, however, learned how to penetrate a Time Lord's mind from the hand of Omega, the plans of which allowed them to harness greater power to break through the Doctor's psychic defences. Once the Doctor was their puppet, he helped build a similar weapon to the hand, which allowed the Daleks to begin rebuilding their empire. By the time the Doctor regained his senses and escaped with the aid of his old Time Lady friend Romana, who rescued him, the Daleks had already conquered hundreds of planets and re-established themselves as a galactic power. In his attempt to destroy them, oh my god, my voice went weird. In his attempt to destroy them, the Doctor had tragically made the monsters more powerful than ever before. During this time, the Daleks attempted to create numerous weapons that could alter the fabric of time itself, including, most notably, the Time Destructor, though, ironically, the creation of this weapon was foiled by an earlier incarnation of the Doctor, who had no idea his future self's knowledge had led to its creation. The Time Destructor incident led to the Third Dalek War in the 41st century, the greatest and most prolonged of all the Dalek conflicts humanity has ever endured. It lasted for almost 100 years. During the war, humanity was part of an alliance with over 50 other races, including, ironically, those who had initially attempted to ally with the Daleks. Naturally, alliances with Daleks don't tend to last too long. Even with his help, humanity was only able to hold the Daleks back for almost the entire war, and would have surely lost it had it not been for the Doctor. For decades, the Doctor tried to find a way to help us, without further altering history than he had already done so. However, when he was part of a successful attack on Anatolin, that by this stage was referred to as Skaro, with the Dalek Prime trying to downplay the destruction of their world for propaganda purposes, the Doctor was able to hack into the Daleks' time sphere. For all intents and purposes, this was a crude version of the Eye of Harmony he had built for them, with the Eye being the ancient device that grants the Time Lords their power. Even with the Doctor's help, the Daleks hadn't been able to perfect the construction of a power source on that level. You have to remember that whilst the Doctor had, ironically, had a greater impact on the universe than any individual Time Lord, Omega, the Time Lord engineer who constructed the hand, was truly the greatest scientist their species ever produced. When it comes to the technical side of things, the Doctor, whilst a genius by our standards, wasn't particularly remarkable among his own people, having apparently only scraped by with 50% at the fabled Time Lord Academy. His ignorance of Time Lord technology was somewhat backed up by the fact that, despite his claims to the contrary, he hadn't been able to fix the chameleon circuit of his TARDIS properly in goodness knows how many centuries. He always claimed to me that he had grown accustomed to the blue box shape, but I always felt that was an excuse. Nevertheless, whilst the Daleks still weren't on the Time Lord's level yet, the Time Sphere gave the monsters the ability to look into numerous different timelines and predict their outcomes, though these visions were still very vague and confusing, hence why they only had limited success in using it to prevent defeats. The Time Lords possessed a similar, much clearer device back on their home planet, but it was not used except for the most extreme emergencies. According to their legends, Rassilon had been driven insane through looking at the sphere and constantly tried to change history, resulting in the destruction of countless worlds before he placed himself in his tower to repent. The threat of the Daleks again marked the first and only time the sphere had been used since, and even then, the High Council made sure that its use was limited. When the Doctor hacked into the Daleks' time sphere, he was able to make the visions much clearer for himself, and, against his better judgment, looked into it. By that stage, he had been pushed too far by the war, and was willing to do anything to stop the Daleks. The Doctor looked further than either the Time Lords or the Daleks had ever been able, or willing to, and saw visions of a conflict far more horrifying than even he could comprehend: the Time War. In this potential future, the Daleks eventually mastered the Time Lord technology he had left them completely, to the point where they were finally able to wage a full-scale war against the Time Lords, which would become the single most devastating conflict in the history of the universe. The best outcome for this time war, according to the Time Sphere, where the Doctor triumphed, still saw hundreds of billions of worlds destroyed in the crossfire, the laws of time mangled to the point where history was constantly changing in devastating ways, and the Time Lords themselves became corrupted by the conflict to the point where they were no better than the Daleks. The worst potential future, meanwhile, saw the Daleks finally triumph over the Time Lords and go on to devastate all of creation, just as the Time Lord's vision had foretold all those centuries ago. The thousands of years the Doctor had held the Daleks back when he tampered with their creation now meant nothing with the boost he had given them after being under the monster's control. Incidentally, it's also believed that the Dalek Prime may have used this machine to change certain aspects of Dalek history before the war, though it clearly was not in any substantial way. The Doctor, nevertheless, later told me that he found the Daleks from earlier points in their history were advancing at much greater rate than he had previously remembered. The Doctor's only course of action, it seemed, was to change history again. He could not go back and undo his own actions, as that would create a direct paradox with his own history. Instead, he had no choice but to alter it in the present, and so he gave humanity and numerous other races advanced technology from the future, though he made sure it could not be traced back to him so as to remain hidden in the shadows, instead supplying it to his numerous allies, who took credit on his urging. The Doctor later told me that humanity would have never come close to developing this technology for thousands of years to come had he not intervened. Only with this boost from the Doctor did the Alliance of Planets finally, after a century of loss and bloodshed, manage to turn the tide against the Daleks, destroying their armies and pushing them back to the outer reaches of the galaxy, with their time sphere and time travel technology being permanently destroyed and the Dalek Prime finally meeting his end. Tragically, many of the planets the Daleks had conquered were blitzed and destroyed by humanity and her allies, with no attempt to liberate them, as the Alliance was so desperate to get rid of the Dalek invasion force. Millions more innocent lives were sacrificed as a result. The Daleks were seemingly wiped out at the end of the war as Anatolin, New Skaro, was raised, and as you know, there hasn't been a Dalek attack for close to 1,000 years since the war ended. The Doctor told me that they will one day return, however. They always do. In fact, tragically, they are among the species who endure until the end of the universe's history alongside humanity. Still, he assured me that my generation, and hundreds after me, won't have to worry about them at least, and that his changes prevented the Time War from ever happening. The Time Lord, it seems, has attempted to educate himself on our history more than in his younger days. From what he had seen of their future, the Daleks will never come close to being as powerful as the Time Lords ever again after the loss of the Dalek Prime. Still, whilst the Doctor had set his bitterest enemies back by hundreds of thousands of years yet again, the after effects of the technology that he gave to humanity and the other races, and even the technology we were able to salvage from the Daleks, led to numerous other wars between the former allies, and changes to history whose after effects will endure for thousands, if not millions of years. This once again made the Doctor a hated renegade among his people, even though he saved them from damnation in the Time War. In their arrogance, the High Council refused to believe its version of the future, or where they became monsters, could ever have come to pass. Still, in all fairness to the Time Lords, the amount of people who died from the Doctor's actions, or worse, who were erased from history completely, is truly beyond comprehension. Ironically, history as I know it only exists because of the Doctor's changes. The Time Agency was created from a combination of technology we used to defeat the Daleks and their own weapons, both of which came from the Doctor. Who knows if I even existed in the original events, and if I did, what my life would have been like in the other world. Who knows if the other world would have been better? Whilst there were many more years of fighting and killing after defeating the Daleks, we are now living in the greatest period of human history in over 2,000 years. Still, whilst it may be easy for me to dismiss this, the burden of all the lost lives, and the lives that never were, on a Doctor, must be unimaginable. In fact, it was so great that he actually did lose the will to live in his 8th incarnation, who died in the final assault against the Daleks in the Third War. The Dalek Prime was about to utilise his ultimate weapon, one that even he had been terrified to use, that could have attempted to weaponise time holes. Had the Dalek Prime been able to use this, even without advantage from the Doctor, he would most surely have destroyed our planet and many more within the Alliance. The Doctor at that point was travelling with a young woman named Dana, who had also lost everything to the Daleks. Her real name was actually Justine, and she was born in 1951 in London. Her family were killed by the renegade Dalek faction, looking for the Hand of Omega when they arrived in 1963. The monster spared her for a far more sinister purpose. The Daleks, despite being driven by a rational hatred and xenophobia, relied entirely on logic when solving their problems. They had no emotions or purpose beyond conquest after all. This had been their undoing centuries ago, when they became trapped in a logical stalemate with the equally ruthless, cold and logical Mavellan race. In order to ensure that would never happen again, the Daleks often captured more emotional, imaginative creatures, brainwashed them into being their lackeys, elevated their intelligence, and then plugged them into war machines, allowing the slave to think up new strategies for the Daleks. Justine was chosen for this purpose, not only became part of the renegade Daleks' battle computer on Earth, she also served as an agent for the Daleks, being able to monitor their enemies from the Imperial faction to the human military to the Doctor himself, without drawing suspicion. After the Black Dalek Supreme, who she was connected with, died, Justine was freed from their control, but sadly, she was left broken mentally by the ordeal and spent a further 2 decades in a mental institution. When she was finally released in the mid-80s, Justine travelled the world, searching for other signs of alien visitations. During that time, she went by many aliases, with Dana being the one she eventually settled on. It was reportedly after another young girl, who had been abducted and experimented on by aliens, who Justine helped overcome her trauma. She was also desperate, in many ways, to escape her old identity and life, and even changed her appearance somewhat, dyeing her hair jet black and affecting a different accent. Eventually, she met the Doctor, and soon joined him as his new travelling companion. Whilst she and the Doctor were friends, and they did many good things together, Dana, at least at that point, was more concerned with revenge against the Daleks than anything else. The Doctor, after all he had been through from Dalek X, was only too eager to oblige, and neither were able to hold the other back. The two spent years in the Third Dalek War. During that time, Dana also became romantically involved with Absalom Dark, a Dalek bounty hunter from the outer colonies that had shunned themselves from the war. foolishly believing that their neutrality would protect them from the Dalek threat. Dark is believed to have personally killed over 300 Daleks in direct combat. Dark also further influenced the Doctor to become consumed by his hatred, which in the end spurred the Time Lord on to make the final attack against the Dalek Prime's new weapon, not caring of the risk to himself. Ironically though, Dark and Dana, on her urging, rescued the Doctor from certain death, though the injuries he sustained still caused him to regenerate into his 9th incarnation. After the war was over, the 9th Doctor and Dana, having both realised the extent at which they were willing to go to finish the Daleks, tried to change. The Doctor, at least, said to me that whilst he would always have regrets about how he dealt with the Daleks, he was nevertheless content that the Time War had been prevented and their power crippled for thousands of years. He and Dana also continued to travel together for many years into his 9th incarnation. Again, having met the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th and 13th Doctors many times, it was obvious that underneath the burden of the extent they changed human history tormented them every second of every day. Furthermore, the only time I ever saw the 9th encounter the Daleks, he was a completely different man. More than any regeneration before, his hatred nearly consumed him. Personally, I think the Doctor took the only course of action that any decent person could have against the Daleks. He didn't play God in erasing them, but didn't sit back and allow the most terrible evil the universe had ever known to reach its greatest potential. I should mention that I have encountered Doctors from other realities. At one point on my travels, my time rotor malfunctioned again. My time ship was about as reliable as the Doctor's TARDIS. Rather than simply phase my ship into the vortex, it pushed it into another reality. According to the Doctor, our universe exists in a multiverse known simply as the 5th multiverse, as it's the 5th multiverse in a line of multiverses and omniverses in the void. With others in our line, including the Alpha and Omega omniverses, there are potentially billions of realities in the 5th multiverse, and I spent a long while travelling through several of them before I finally got home. The Doctor existed in most universes, though not all. I spent quite a long while, actually, in a universe that had no Time Lords, or Daleks, or Cybermen, in its version of the 23rd century, which was something of a golden age for humanity, though that's a story for another time. In some universes, the Doctor's history was exactly the same as in mine. In others, it was similar to a point, whilst others were completely different. I finally found a version who could help me pinpoint my universe. In his reality, the Time War happened, though he had at least been able to stop a Dalek victory at great cost. This Doctor was in his 10th incarnation when I met him, who was very different to mine. He was a much younger-looking, somewhat more dashing, and quite charming fellow, though clearly the war had changed him in such a way that even regeneration never could. He was able to help steer my ship back to my home reality, as he had visited it several times and even encountered my Doctor, with the two having dealt with more than a few interdimensional crises together. Neither seemed to have much of a high opinion of the other, however, as when I later brought it up to my Doctor, he rolled his eyes at the mention of his counterpart. It seems the key difference in their history was that this Doctor did not look into the Dalek time sphere. He felt that doing so would have given him too much power, and as a result, he did not push to see the future. It was a split-second decision that ultimately changed the entire course of history for that universe, as the Doctor would not get another chance to hack into the monster's time sphere, and the Daleks would continue to advance until they conquered the Earth and other worlds again, with their power becoming so great the Time Lords were forced to intervene, leading to the Time War, with the Dalek Prime becoming the 3rd Emperor of this reality. Davros also survived, though whether this was from a deviation or if it means he has survived in our world too is not known. Both would finally unite their Dalek factions against the Time Lords, allowing the monsters to be a greater force than ever before. Just as our Doctor's vision predicted, the Time War devastated both the future and the past of this universe's history, leading to many changes in the Doctor's own personal history. I don't know if my Doctor and his counterpart's dislike for one another was out of judgment for how the other had dealt with the crisis of the Third Dalek War with humanity. Either way, both were just as haunted by the guilt as both would have undoubtedly been if they had erased the Daleks all those years ago on Skaro. Time travel is not a blessing. It is a curse, one that lures you in with promises of reliving the past, meeting all of the great figures from throughout history, and conquering the natural order of the universe itself. We delude ourselves into thinking that a harmless journey into the 20th century to hang out with great artists is nothing. But as soon as you set foot in the 20th century, you are faced with the reality that you have knowledge that could avert tragedies from the Titanic to the First World War. When you choose not to help, you are instantly culpable in the same way the Doctor was when he refused to finish the Daleks. Yet, if you went back and averted them all, the consequences would be beyond comprehension. I can't tell you how happy I am that part of my life is over. Whilst I don't regret everything I did with the agency, on the contrary, I am proud of it. At the same time, if I had known the truth of the extent of the weight on my, and indeed anyone else who takes part's shoulders, I may never have bothered in the first place. It's important that any other potential time traveller understands this. I pity the Doctor, who, like many wanderers in the fourth dimension, was seduced by the promise of seeing the wonders of all of time and space, yet has now found himself with the greatest burden of them all in his dealings with the Daleks. I only hope that one day, somewhere, in all of time and space, he and his counterpart find the peace that sadly the universe will never know from the horror of the Daleks.